Okay, so I am going to do a screen share. Welcome all of you who've made it. I can't tell, quite honestly, how many people have made it this morning. It keeps toggling back and forth between people. But whoever has made it this morning, I appreciate your showing up on time, like I said. I'm sorry for the delay. Let me make sure that you can see. Good. All right, so you should be seeing exactly what I'm seeing. I'm going to follow through the object, or the sort of general agenda for this today is to go through the content and give everyone a chance, or anyone who has questions, a chance at the end for questions. So if you have questions along the way, I'm actually not going to see them just yet. Go on and type them out and put them up if you want, and I'll address them in the order they come in. So I'm going to move through this a little bit quickly. That said, don't feel afraid to ask questions at the end if you have any. So how to make the cut on the ACT. So what we're going to look at is 5 very critical mistakes that a lot of students and parents, including students and parents, commonly make when they're preparing or performing on the ACT. We'll go through those one by one. We've got a quick look that we'll want to take at the average scores. That includes both national and state scores. The majority of people joining this today are likely to be in Louisiana, but I have included some broadcasting tags for those in Colorado as well. That's going to be less relevant, probably because Colorado was actually skipping ACT, at least for this year, possibly the future as well. But just for the sake of comparison, that will be included in our average scores, our score averages. And then we will look at sort of a general study timeline. This is a timeline that I've implemented with the majority of my students, plus or minus the typos, as you can see in the text. And then my general recommendations as far as resources and whatnot as well. So really quickly, who am I? My name is Kelsey, and I've been doing private online and sort of in-person one-on-one and group high school math tutoring, primarily math tutoring. I also have done some English and Japanese language tutoring as well. And I now also do test prep. About the past year, I've been focusing on the ACT specifically, with prospects of opening up to SAT in the next year or two as well. My background is I started as an assistant language teacher for the JET program. That's a Japanese English teaching program. I was in Japan. I taught in public schools for a while, mostly as an assistant, although I was given lots of opportunities to be the lead teacher, whether I wanted to or not. And then following a couple of years of that, I actually joined with a business partner of mine to form Mitoyo International Exchange. That's incorporated, that's not the government office. And that company provided some additional schooling for high schoolers. Quite honestly, it ended up including an age range all the way down from 4 years old all the way up to, I believe, 75 years old was the oldest student we had. So I've taught a large age range of people in multiple languages, having to use Japanese sometimes to influence people in English and such. So I've been kind of all over the place with what I've had to be prepared to offer students. And then a little bit more recently, LingQ, which I believe is out of popularity these days, but it was a very popular online English and general languages tutoring service, and provided all sorts of things, but did that for a couple of years just online. So Wyzant has been my main form of how I've helped people out these days, and anyone who's interested is I'll be sure to invite to look me up on Wyzant. Oh, okay, well, there's some information. Okay, the slides aren't quite perfect yet. The ACT. So let's take a quick look just at what we're talking about when we're talking about the ACT. So we've got this sections breakdown that I've thrown together real quick. You have 5 sections, and the writing section is optional. This has changed over the past 25 years. You're not going to see the same section titles as you will for this presentation, but be aware that this is what the ACT currently looks like and its current percentage breakdown. You have English, math, reading and science, and the optional writing for ELA scores if you wish to send those to your colleges or universities, if they accept that or even care about that. And their breakdowns are a little bit different, as you can tell. We have 45 minutes, 75 questions you answer in 45 minutes for English, 60 out of 60 for mathematics. That's 1 question per minute for mathematics. Reading and science are exactly the same, 40 questions in 35 minutes. So you may start to notice that one of the important aspects of practicing and preparing for the ACT is getting a real decent sense of time management. Just looking at that alone, mathematics obviously is a minute per question, but for the others as well, English, you have a lot to answer in just 45 minutes. Reading, you get a little bit more than that, which is nice, and science a little bit more, but not much. That everything is generally meant to be answered in less than a minute. And one thing that we will talk about later are what are called simple solutions, where we take advantage of the nature and structure of the test to bypass the maximum amount of time it would otherwise require to get a problem done. Notice too that in the percentages, these are just general breakdowns. Reading, by the way, does not have percentages. Generally, you have social studies, natural sciences, fiction, and humanities that you'll be looking at. The others, they will generally, I'd say pretty strictly, hold to these percentages. So what you might start to think about as a student or parent is, where is the maximum amount of study time really being leveraged? If I look at, and mathematics just being my favorite because I've done the most with that with students, and most students find mathematics to be the most difficult, along with science, the most difficult section to try and conquer. You're generally looking at early algebra as comprising a very large percentage of the test. So if we were to really just break this down into algebra, geometry, and trigonometry, you'd have over half of it corresponding to early algebra skills. So the idea that I've heard students say there are calculus questions on the ACT, and while there may be some calculus, pre-calculus terminology that actually is also used earlier on, but people don't remember up to that point, the concepts, the standardized nature of the ACT and standardized testing in general requires there to be nothing over the level of trigonometry. And even that typically can just boil down to general basic maths at the algebra level. So all of these percentages gives you an opportunity to really think about what should I focus on most. And if I'm doing really well in punctuation and grammar, then maybe I should spend more time on rhetorical skills and English, for instance. Feel free to ask questions about that at the end. We're going to go into the 5 massive mistakes, the mistakes that most students make on the ACT. Number 5 is not knowing important terminology. So what I mean by that is that the ACT and all the tests in general, but I'm going to speak, of course, primarily about the ACT today. The ACT uses very specific terminology in almost all of its word problems, and it repeatedly uses it. Not just question after question, but year after year, it uses similar terminology. And if there's anything that tends to confound students more, it's just not being familiar with it. Some examples are positive integers. This is on the math section, for instance. Positive integers. Probability of such and such. Even the word altitude, which of course to you and me will generally mean height or level above, but in altitude in geometry is a very specific line and a triangle. Now, I demonstrate in a lot of questions and videos how if you don't remember certain words, such as altitude, you can actually get around that by taking advantage of the structure of the test and the answers. And we'll talk more about that later. But generally, you could do yourself a lot of good by simply getting familiar with the terminology itself. That will give you a huge clue as to what type of math is going to be most useful for you to apply to a given problem in the case of the math section. In the case of other sections as well, it might give you a clue as to, let's take the science section, what graph or chart or even paragraph to look at, as opposed to having to come up with what we'll call outside knowledge to know what these things are ahead of time. Not everybody's aware what a positive integer is, for instance. And you might think, oh, I need to know what this is in order to solve for it. That's not actually true, but it could be helpful. If there's anything in terms of outside knowledge, that is something that you don't glean from the questions or answers directly from the test, it is probably terminology more than anything else. And I say that even over formulas. Now, I'm going to do a quick plug-in about this. I do feel that formulas are helpful. Again, it can give you an edge over someone else who doesn't use them. They are not the end-all be-all, especially for mathematics I'm talking about, of course. And I do think that terms are more important because you have to understand what the question is or the nature of the question in order to do something about it. And the ACT, renownedly, does not give you a formula sheet at the very beginning of the math section, for instance, as the SAT or other types of standardized tests typically do. So most parents and students probably get very nervous about memorizing a bunch of formulas. Now, if you go to my website at mathsamurai.com, you will actually see a place where you can download a free PDF of the formulas, most common formulas that you are expected to know or in certain situations are given in questions on the ACT. And that can be very helpful for people who want to either relieve their fears around that. It also is helpful for those who are already feeling pretty decent in some areas, but they want that extra edge. They want to be able to get through the test or the section a little bit faster, and sometimes knowing the formulas can help. An example would be the most common example, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, Pythagorean theorem. For those of you who are aware of what that is, the ACT loves Pythagorean theorem. They love triangles. So the more you know about those things in the math section specifically, the more likely you can get through particular questions more quickly, and the more likely you'll be able to break down other questions where that doesn't seem relevant at first. You might be able to come up with creative solutions to those questions by just knowing a couple of really basic formulas. So again, if you want the extra edge or you just want to kind of alleviate your fears around that, go to mathsamurai.com and look for where you can download a free copy of those formulas. All right, that's enough on Math Samurai for now, though. That's my own deal. I want to get to the rest of this list. Number 4, it is a very common mistake for students to answer faster as opposed to answering smarter. What that means is there's a huge emphasis on time management. And in my opinion, it's overemphasized. It's extremely important. There's no doubt about it. But the problem with overemphasizing on time management over how you answer questions is that it gives the impression that student A might get a better score if he simply knows how to answer faster than student B. And that's just not true. If there's any increase in the amount of time that you save when you're going through a section on the test, it's primarily because you've learned how to test well. You've learned how to take what I call an answers first approach, which means that you're restraining the possible answers by the choices that are given. We'll get more into that in a second. Much more important that you're able to harness test-taking skills over simply practice time management. Time management seems to say that you can do the same thing but faster. I argue that you will save time and as an effect, move faster through sections of the test if you instead focus on the test-taking skills itself. So as an example, every ACT math question, as we said, has to be by the criteria of the standardized test, must be capable of being answered in a minute or less. And some can be answered in less than that, 10 seconds. And these are what I called simple solutions at some point, sometimes even called 30-second solutions. 30-second solutions or simple solutions are where you are able to take advantage again of the structure of the test to look for a creative way to answer something that would appear to take a minute, as much as a minute. And for a lot of us, honestly, more than a minute, only because we don't know what we're doing. It has to be possible to answer it in under a minute. That doesn't mean at a standard level of criteria. But that does not mean that everybody will take less than a minute. That's why it's really helpful to glean as much extra time through the test as you can, not by simply trying to go faster, but by creatively coming up with what are called simple solutions or creative ways of answering the same question using less of, say, the math, in the case of the math section, less of the math that you were taught in school, the way you might answer a test question in a math class, and more the way that you would do it on a standardized test like this, where the answers are given to you and really everything that you need is provided right in the question itself. And again, we'll get more into that in a moment, but instead of focusing on time management, which results in more careless errors, I say more careless errors because I see the smartest students making careless errors, trying to go far too quickly, as opposed to, and they're missing important elements to the question. They're missing the fact that the answer choices are going to include within them booby traps, I call them, basically answers that would appear to be correct if you got them by the rigorous math way, the way that you were taught to do it in math class. You can make more errors by thinking that you're doing it right and being overconfident in your time management skills, as opposed to actually coming up, practicing and performing well in coming up with simple solutions. So I emphasize focusing on creative thinking over fast thinking. Rather than worry about trying to go faster, try to figure out how you can come up with a simpler version of the question, or decode the question to be able to not worry so much on outside knowledge you bring to the question. Science section is a really great example of this. If it says to refer to figure 1, which is all about isotopes of a molecule compound that includes nitrogen, forget everything you know about nitrogen and molecules. Focus on the graph, focus on the chart that it's talking about. In other words, continue to practice your test taking skills. Everything of the answers in there. Don't worry about whether or not you can think faster, worry about whether or not you can come up with a simpler solution. Okay, on to number 3. So forgetting to get hints from the answers, and it's sort of what I'm alluding to again, but this is a very, very common mistake as well. There's a tendency to try and solve these multiple choice questions as if the answer is not right there in front of you to begin with. And because the answer is right in front of you, it has to be one of those 4 answers and only one of those 4 answers. There's no interpretation involved. There's no subjectivity. The others are 100% wrong, and only one of them is 100% right, black and white. Because you know it's right in front of you, there has to be a correlating pattern between the answer, the correct answer, and the question itself. So looking for hints to how to answer the question will be in the answers itself, what sort of answers they give you. Again, if you're using a rigorous math approach and trying to bring in this outside knowledge, which we talked about already, the liability of that, and your habits that you accumulated, you cultivated through math class, through math test after math test. It says solve for X, solve for X, solve for X, instead of looking at the answers and looking for what they might be expecting you to answer with. You'll find that you'll make far more errors because the ACT isn't asking for the same thing that most math class tests generally do. It's asking for a creative solution to a confusing looking problem. So the most important thing that a student can do in preparation for this is to practice analyzing ACT questions in general. And then the way you practice analyzing questions is to take this answers first approach. You look at the answers and notice patterns between the answers. Notice patterns between what the answers are giving you and what kind of math you maybe have been trained to use to answer that specific kind of question. It can give you a lot of general hints at what you should and shouldn't do. This is just as relevant, of course, in other tests. If you were doing a reading section question, for instance, the passages are very long. And while generally different strategies will work just fine, you can read the passage first, provided that you're fairly skilled at paced reading, what I call paced reading, or not exactly speed reading. You're not just worried about going fast, but being detail-oriented, yet at a generally moderate pace. It doesn't matter if you do that first and then look at the answers necessarily, but it can certainly help trim down a lot of what you need to focus on by looking at answers first and look at what they might expect you to answer based on, again, booby traps that are placed within that reading passage. Just because an answer, if you have 4 answers and all the answers say that he committed the fraud, and then it doesn't matter in the reading passage so much whether it says he committed the fraud or not. All the answers say he did. You need to instead look for the difference between the answers. Did he commit the fraud this way? Did he commit the fraud that way, etc.? That is going to be the most relevant and important pattern in there to then look for in the reading passage, as an example. Again, if there are questions as to what I'm talking about around this, I'm going to get to a little bit more specificity in this, but I will also invite you to go on and type questions in the chat box, or simply think about what questions and ask at the end. Okay, number 2, not checking your work. There is a time constraint to checking your work, and I put the right way because there is a right and a wrong way to do it. There is a major time constraint, obviously, on each of the sections. You saw how they were all expecting less than a minute to answer them. And so it is not uncommon by any measure for students to move quickly, and for that very purpose, put down an answer, bubble in an answer, and not check in some even rudimentary way, 2 seconds, whatever it takes, to be sure that they didn't make a mistake. That can take literally 2 seconds to look over a question. And here's the most common thing that students will do. They'll do things the same way twice in order to check it, if they think to check it at all. That means that they're probably, because your brain state has not altered between 30 seconds ago and right now, that means they're probably making the same mistake twice. And the ACT, of course, bets on this happening. If you, again, have been trained to do it a certain way in math class, doing it that way the first round may be fine. Maybe you'll get the right answer, but maybe you'll also make a little mistake in there that you didn't realize it might be the way that you would actually do it in a math class test, but would be actually wrong in that situation as well. If you took the time, major time waste as well, but if you took the time to repeat the same steps that you took to getting the answer on the ACT, if you repeated those steps to check it, you are very, very likely to be making the same mistake again. So it's really a waste of time, if anything, to do it the same way twice. This also is just sort of a side effect of being overconfident that you're doing the math correctly. If you did it the same way, then you got it again the same way. You're very likely to be overconfident in assuming that your answer must be correct, as opposed to looking for patterns again in the answer. So again, you want to start to train to solve one way and check it another way. You want to look for different strategies for solving it, simple solutions, for instance, and then using some way to check for it. An example on the math section would be, if you got a certain value for X, well, plug in X. Be sure that X really does work. Or if you used the answers, my recommended way, depending on what type of question it is, if you used the multiple choice answers to plug in for X in a formula or in a function, then double check some value, some other value. So for instance, you choose 2 and you plug that in in the function and check, and you got the same answer that the question is asking for, great. But don't use that same way to check it. try 3 and make sure that if you plug in 3 or maybe 4 or something, you don't get the answer the same. It doesn't end up working again. It doesn't end up being the same value that the question says you should get. That will be a very obvious sign that your method was not the correct way to answer that question. Another quick thing, as far as multiple solutions, finding different strategies, finding different solutions to the same problem, practice being detail-oriented. This will also help negate the need to check so rigorously when you do, is if from the beginning and at the end when you do check, you are extremely detail-oriented. Again, this is emphasizing being perfectionistic at some level, not slow, but learning how to check at every level of detail. When you practice being detail-oriented, you get better at being detail-oriented, which means ultimately you get faster at being detail-oriented. So don't confuse being detail-oriented with being slower, but at the beginning, as you're practicing for the ACT, risk being slow as you're practicing and preparing and studying for it, if it means that you're practicing the right skills, which means being detail-oriented. Very, very important and not emphasized enough in a lot of tutoring programs and tutors in general, I would say. And number one, the absolute number one biggest massive mistake that students make is what we can call failing to know your enemy. What this means is Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War, and as just a very short history lesson, those who do or don't know The Art of War may be aware that he got a huge chunk of his credibility in the Battle of Boju, where he defeated the Chu clan on behalf of the Wu clan. And having defeated them, he became well known. Now, there's some debate as to whether he existed or not, but certainly the work he published has been used for thousands of years since his time. Today, Wall Street stockbrokers to this day probably make this required reading, The Art of War. Sun Tzu's words echo up to this point in history because the way that you approach anything when it comes to needing to conquer your finances or something like the ACT requires that you know two things. You need to know yourself and you need to know your enemy. To quote him here, know your enemy and know yourself. Find not in fear for 100 battles. Know yourself but not your enemy. Find level of loss and victory. Know thy enemy but not yourself. Wallow in defeat every time. So if you know both yourself and your enemy, you are, in other words, practically guaranteed to win every battle, or at least 100 out of however many battles, the next 100 battles. So what does this mean, though? Knowing yourself at this point is going to be more apparent when we start to look at the study timeline. But there is a way that you can approach the test that gives you a better glimpse at what you're capable of and what you know already and what weaknesses you should work on. And that's very important. We'll get to that in just a second. But just as important is knowing who the enemy is. In this case, that is the ACT. So again, referring to Sun Tzu for a moment, if Sun Tzu had written this book on the strategies of defeating the enemy, or any book, or had informed his own army of Wu tribe members how to defeat the Chu clan by the Chu state, by going to the enemy and saying, hi, look, I'm just a local, we are planning on building this big military, and I'm just curious because, you know, we're going to go to battle anyway. Would you mind telling me some of your strategies so that we can be prepared for it? This sounds ridiculous to us. Of course not. You wouldn't go to the enemy and ask them for advice on how to conquer them or defeat them. But that is exactly what lots of people, time in and time out, do. There's a misperception that those who are testing well in school are those who are going to get high scores on the ACT. And the ACT boosts this confidence by providing lots of thorough answers to their questions and their practice problems and so forth in a rigorous sort of way in the case of math or in the case of science or reading, in a way that is explained as if it were the same way on the ACT as it were in your typical school classroom. And it is not. It doesn't work that way. That's why, and you'll see in a second, that it's very important to, of course, only get problems and questions from the ACT itself. That's very important. If Sun Tzu had not actually studied the strategies of the Chu state, then they would have not have defeated them. But to ask the Chu for explanations to their own strategies would have been a huge error, and to actually rely on that as accurate information, unfortunately, would be a grave error. The same goes here. Asking the ACT how they would solve the problems is going to be exactly the way they want you to solve the problems, which is in the rigorous, old school, fashionable sort of way, conventional way that most people do. So you are going to waste tons of money on all these tutoring programs and ACT bent programs, anything that is not looking at the ACT as an enemy to be conquered, as opposed to just a service that's working for you. I'm not saying that we should demonize the ACT by any measure. ACT Inc. is providing a service, and it's a genuine service, but it is especially catering to the colleges and universities that students are applying to, not to the students themselves. And all sorts of opinions about that aside, the important thing to realize is that the questions and problems from the ACT are the ones you should be working with. Who you work with is going to very much determine how well you do on the ACT, depending on whether or not they are catering to the ACT, that is, catering to what works best for the ACT for you to test with, that is the way that they would solve those questions and problems, as opposed to catering to what's going to work best for you, how you will want to solve these problems and questions because you want to conquer the ACT. So as opposed to just how to get a high score the conventional way, think about instead, if you're going to invest money in strategies for preparing and studying for the ACT, ask yourself, and I'm not saying don't invest, definitely consider all the free options and invest as well. And I'll give you a couple of resources on both of those accounts, but definitely think about, is this person wanting me to solve it the way the ACT would want me to solve it? Because then we're going to play the ACT's game the way that they want to play it. Or is this person going to teach me how to play chess in a way that the opponent isn't expecting, isn't necessarily being able to cover their bases for? And the ACT test does have glaring weaknesses. But they're only glaring if somebody points them out, who knows the test, such as the fact that the standardization of it requires in multiple choice form certain words and certain ways of asking to be mandatory. And again, there's not enough time to get into all the details of that, but just be very, very careful. Research very well who you decide to get your help with on doing the ACT. This is a bonus one. I wanted to throw this in there, and I'm only going to take a second to throw it in there, but there is such a thing as overstudying. This is another mistake that is commonly made. Overstudying is not uncommon at all. This is from the Huffington Post, and it's very important to understand what this means, because again, overstudying is essentially going to equate with over-investing at this time. This is a $13.1 billion industry on behalf of the parents alone. Never mind the schools and everything else, a multi-billion-dollar industry. And I put often praise on ignorance. Now, I'm not talking about the ACT preying on your ignorance. I don't feel that way about it. But what I do feel like is there are plenty of programs and tutors and all sorts of things out there that are looking to take advantage of the fact that students and parents don't really know what they're doing, and they don't know what to look for. And that's extremely important in knowing whether you are overstudying or not. I'm going to give an example. There's a common philosophy out there among a lot of tutors and programs that if you study more difficult material, let's take mathematics, you study things that are at the pre-calculus and calculus level, study questions that are designed by that program that are like the ACT. Maybe they don't have multiple choice, maybe they do have multiple choice, but regardless are more difficult than what you would expect or should expect on the ACT, that will prep you for the ACT all the more. Then there will be nothing that will be unfamiliar to you. Well, yes, that would be true if the ACT was really relying on your mathematical knowledge, if it was relying on how much outside knowledge you're bringing in. But the truth is that even to a really good pre-calc student, and I'm saying this from experience, seeing students do this and seeing them get very low scores on the mathematics section, despite being so good in Algebra 2, so good on pre-calculus, going into calculus now with less confidence because they scored so low on the ACT. The ACT isn't testing you for your outside knowledge. They're testing you on your creative thinking and critical thinking skills. So you need to practice test-taking skills, and you need to practice with questions that the ACT itself has designed. So if you study too much, if you study things that are too difficult, or you overstudy in general, that can actually be an investment problem, and that can be a time problem. And ultimately, it can result in lower confidence despite having studied so much, so hard. You could be fantastic at mathematics and still do poorly on the ACT because it isn't designed the same way as typical math class tests. So the solution to this is basically to invest in those resources that utilize questions straight from prior tests, straight from the ACT itself. Sun Tzu should not have studied some other state's strategies of battle to defeat the Chu state. He had to study the Chu state strategies. So in my case, I recommend the Real ACT Prep Guide, or more recently, the official ACT Test Prep Guide is the one that I'm using. It's a little bit more recent. It doesn't overly matter. There's some different opinions around this, but in my opinion, it doesn't really matter as much what year the publishing date was of the book. What matters is that it came from the ACT, because standardization prevents there being very much change year to year as far as the actual test questions are designed. So there needn't be too much attention on that. We've got 10 minutes left. Like I said, I wanted to give a few minutes at the end for Q&A, so I'm going to just work through this part very quickly. The trends in general that we're seeing in terms of the ACT are the following. Again, this is looking more, it's catered a little bit to Colorado and Louisiana specifically. Colorado, they won't mean as much this year, but if only for a base comparison, we might want to note that there are a large number of states, including Louisiana, whose average composite scores on a scale from 1 to 36 are well below the national average. So despite the ACT being dropped in Michigan and Colorado, ACT itself still has a higher turnout rate and a higher requirement rate than the SAT at this time. And as far as that goes, there are many states that are still lagging behind a little bit in their overall composite scores. I believe the highest average score made in Louisiana was in St. Patty? I'm not good with the parishes, but St. Patty Parish, I believe it was, had a 22. That was the highest that was being made. So there's a lot to be said around that. Despite there being an industry here for the ACT and tutoring and programs, there is a real lack in terms of the actual progress being made, despite what the board may be talking about. And I don't mean to directly antagonize the board. I only mean to say that the trends kind of speak for themselves on that level. So in general, it's 25 for flagship schools and universities, 22 for your general universities and such. The acceptance, average acceptance ACT score. I hope that made sense. So the average ACT score of accepted students, 25, 22 for most other general universities and such, and then for TOPS level or TOPS tech schools as low as 17. But in terms of general college and such, you can expect that the benchmark score that the ACT is going to provide for you on its breakdown following the test, that it will consider these to be the benchmarks: 18 for English, 22 for algebra, social sciences. This concerns your college readiness, which is an important thing to assess, and sort of ran out of time to talk more about. So if anyone has more specific questions in regards to that, this is the general study line. Again, instead of going into details about the study timeline, I printed everything up here. You can, of course, still text me for any specific questions or ask questions here if you still want to know what that is. But notice that I have highlighted that if you are going to invest in a tutoring program and such, consider doing so at around the 2 to 3 month mark, as opposed to far out at 6 months or so forth. You can probably get by on free. I do think, depending on what program you're getting into, 4 to 6 months is not a bad time to get started with such a program or tutoring. However, if you're concerned about finances and such, and you want to get started at all, I'm so used to seeing people start getting help at around the 2 week mark, or even the 1 month mark at greatest, and that's just not a great idea. It's really good for these skills to take effect, the practice of these skills to take effect, you really need to give it a greater amount of time. And these are skills that are cultivated through the correct, appropriate way of tutoring them and building them along the way with the student and parent. Some free resources where you can go. Try ACT.org. They do have practice problems for each section. They also have something now called ACT Academy, which I cannot give a proper review of because I've not actually looked into it very much myself. I believe at this time it is free, and I believe every level is free, but again, go there yourself to find out for sure. Just Google ACT Academy. Prep Factory I know is free, will always be free from everything I can tell. These questions are not all from the ACT itself, but it does provide some wonderful modules that explain the types and natures of questions that are on the ACT. Khan Academy is great. It doesn't have ACT material. It has it all for SAT, but the concepts that you would expect to see on the ACT will also be on the SAT, generally speaking. So if you just need concepts review, like we showed at the about 4 to 6 month mark, that's a great place to go. You can go to a very specific page that I don't have listed here, but just Google it. Khan Academy, concepts review for the SAT, very specific link of videos and such you can review concepts with. Now here's some paid options. There's a pre-ACT that I believe, I don't know how much it is. I don't know where I wrote and either, but there's a pre-ACT option that is paid, and I believe some schools provide for that, but you'll have to look into that yourself. I'm not quite sure how much that is. Generally, I don't recommend ACT.org for more than just general practice, because again, they're telling their explanations for how to solve the problems is going to be the way they would do it, not necessarily the way you would do it. There's greentestprep.com. This is probably one of the leading online automated tutoring programs. It's not tutoring, in other words, it's really just an online system that is provided. Adam Green has done a fantastic job of creating this program and charges about $500 one-time fee for the whole program. And then you can compare to that. This is just based on Wyzant alone, the service that I'm a part of, but don't charge as much as some of these. But there's a range there between as little as $10, and quite honestly, the largest I've seen is $500 per hour for tutoring for the ACT. You'll get the biggest bang for your buck somewhere in the middle, I would say, but definitely be not the medium per se, but say around the $100 mark. 100, I'd say 150 or so would be perfect for those of you who are trying to save money. $10, you really have to start questioning why this person is charging so low. And $500, I'm not saying they don't know what they're doing. They probably do. But as far as recurring tutoring is concerned, you'll really need more than just an assessment of what you're doing wrong. You really need to be cultivating certain skills. I, for instance, despite being part of Wyzant, have chosen to stay at around the 139 mark. And anyone who contacts me having seen this webinar will be charged $99. So if you attended this webinar, just text me the words ACT Math Samurai and let me know what you thought of the webinar, and I'll know that you watched it, and I'd be happy to give you a $99, a huge discount at $99 for my tutoring specifically. So we're at the very end here. I don't know how many people are here. I'm only going to have the time, I think, to answer a couple of questions. So let me scoot on back, to our Hangout here. I'm going to stop running this for the moment. So if there is anybody, again, I can't quite tell how many people are viewing this at this moment. If there are any questions at this time, I would be happy to answer them. I'm just going over to make sure I haven't skipped anything while I wait. Okay, so one question, private question here. So they wrote, how can I generally progress in scoring more points? Guessing this is a student. That's a great question. So let me rephrase the question, because instead of focusing on scoring more points, I honestly advise that you focus instead on avoiding losing points. Now, this may feel like a really weird nuance to be making. The tendency to want to score more points, I've noticed, tends to couple with the desire to go through the test faster. Time management, all those other things we covered in the presentation. So if you're just looking to score more points, you're probably working on getting faster. You're probably working on better time management and such. What I invite you instead to think about is, how can you avoid losing points? Because what that means is that's inviting you to think about your weaknesses and in what ways that you currently maybe make a lot of careless errors that you aren't noticing. Again, it happens a lot of the time. The way that you check your work, the way that you come up with simple solutions, 30-second solutions or otherwise, that is going to be much more powerful than working on scoring points. Regardless of what approach you take to that, start early, train a lot. Depending on how close you are to the test date, you can spend, it is so much better to spend 20 minutes every day or 15 minutes a day on prepping for it as much as 3 months, 4 months out, every day doing it that way. Then, obviously we've got the test in a week. So if you're taking the test this Saturday and you're just getting started, my first of all, honest advice is that unless you've been scoring really well so far, manage your expectations around that. This is the same as archery. You are learning how to shoot an arrow as opposed to just cram for your regular math test. Cramming for a regular math test means you can memorize all the information. It's going to be on the test. So if you memorize the strategies and such, you'll just have to apply it when you get on the test the next day. Doesn't work that way on the ACT and standardized testing. You have to cultivate test-taking skills. If I told you you're taking an archery competition, you're submitted, you're going to take it, you're going to be in one next week, you'd probably not have high expectations around being able to shoot an arrow with perfect precision by next week. Think of this test the same way. That's how the ACT tends to function. About all I can think to say on that. Maybe just one more question before wrapping up. And anyone who's been on here up to this point, if you have to leave at 11, I completely understand. Okay, so another private message as it's thinking. Okay, so it says, I have a tendency to get stuck on problems and it wastes a lot of time. How can I avoid getting stuck on problems? Okay, that in a way that's a little bit similar to what we were just looking at a moment ago. The most important thing that you want to focus on again is take an answers first approach to things. If you're getting stuck on a problem, it's probably because you are rehashing the same strategy over and over again, trying to reapply something that probably didn't work the first time, or else you would have the answer by now. In which case you want to focus on a different strategy. Look at the answers first, check out the multiple choices, see what's available, and look for any patterns in there. Use anything that, if nothing else, is going to provide a way of jogging your memory. When you find those patterns, you're often reminded what kind of math is appropriate. So either you're using the wrong math, or there maybe is something that you missed in the question that will be clarified by looking more closely at the answer. So taking an answers first approach is one way of doing a little bit better. And of course, checking your work, honestly, if you've practiced checking your work, you're already going to have that skill of thinking of different strategies for solving the same question. Okay, thank you so much. We went a couple of minutes over, but only a couple. I appreciate everybody who showed up this morning. Thank you so much. Thank you for being patient during the technical difficulties. Thank you for being patient during my slides and some of the typos. This was a great first run through. I hope to do this at least once a month. And in the meantime, feel free to get in touch with me if you would like some additional assistance with your ACT tutoring, your ACT studying in general through tutoring. And I wish you the very best next week, those of you who are taking the test next week, and everyone else, prep early and study hard. And I wish you the very best. Thank you very much.